field. So I'm delighted today to introduce you to Sara Bailey, who is a central key player on this application funding call. And Sara has been involved in the application for the AHRC funding, and she knows a lot about ethics because she's been there and lived it and has worked in the field. So Sara, before we sort of talk about some of the main ethical issues that you've had to deal with in the field, could you just introduce yourself and tell us a bit about your background and where you have been working and where you're working now?
Sure, thank you, Rachel. I am a human rights project advisor on the MENAS project. And before I started sort of being involved in that project, I did a PhD in sociology of human rights at the University of Essex, where I did my field research in India, mainly with policymakers as my participants. But before that, I was very interested to spend some time in the Middle East. So after doing my master's, I worked in Palestine for about 4 years, including in the Garza Strip for approximately a year, doing research with individuals who had been victims or potential victims of human rights violations. And having done my master's and having done a course on ethics and research methods, I felt that I was prepared to go into the proverbial field and put those ethics procedures into practice. And I found that once I actually got there, all these issues came up that I felt that I wasn't adequately prepared to deal with. And I'm presently working at an organisation in the UK where I'm working with individuals with lived experience of inequality. So people who may have experienced complex issues such as criminalisation, mental health problems, homelessness, and all these other type of social problems that come along with, they sort of come hand in hand with inequality. So that's what I'm focused on now. And this itself is raising a whole load of new ethical issues that I'm having to think through on a daily basis.
Okay, well, maybe we can talk through some of those particular issues. So what would you say have been, in your experience, have been the main, maybe the top ethical issues for you as a researcher?
I think the main area and time that I look back on with concern in terms of my ability to deal with and adequately consider ethics in my research was when I was working in the Garza Strip in 2008 and 2009. I went there directly after a significant military attack by the Israeli forces, and Gaza at that time was completely devastated. I was working for an organization that was trying to document the violations and give voice to the people who had been affected by the military attacks. And what I realized was that I wasn't actually equipped to make ethical decisions about who to interview and how to take into consideration the fact that a lot of the interviewees were probably experiencing severe psychological trauma. Unfortunately, I think there was an atmosphere around the research which pushed the researchers into focusing more on the outcomes of the research because there was a human rights and political push to try to get the voices of the people who had been suffering out there in the world. And I don't think enough attention was paid to the impact of the interviews and the research on the individuals who were the research participants, so to speak. And I feel as though we didn't give enough consideration to their well-being and their needs. And I haven't done research like that since, and I still struggle to understand how I could go about making a meaningful assessment of who to interview and who might be too traumatized to interview, given the fact that I believe strongly that adults with capacity have autonomy to give their consent, to be involved in research. But at the same time, as a researcher, I have a responsibility to minimize harm to those participants.
So I guess then, Sara, it's a question of balancing out those two ethical principles there in terms of non-maleficence, in the sense that you don't want to harm anybody, we don't want to harm anybody, and beneficence in that we want to do good in relation to our research. So in actual fact, interviewing individuals in that situation may actually impact on later support and be meaningful in terms of outcomes, so that it helps the wider group. So it's not actually benefiting those precise individuals, but that the research will eventually, hopefully, benefit the group, as it were. However, as you say, on a kind of case-by-case basis, if somebody is so traumatized that talking through their particular experiences is going to cause them more emotional or psychological harm, and there is no support in place to deal with that afterwards, because very often researchers are accused of doing a kind of quick and dirty, going in, getting information, then going out and leaving people in the situation that they're in. So I think you raise a very important ethical consideration there. And I guess it's up to us as researchers to mitigate against that risk. And there's always going to be that risk. And there's always going to be, if in a sense, we have we need to do the research, we need to tell the stories of individuals, but we also need to mitigate against emotional and psychological harm and be sensitive, I guess, and be sensitive in the way that we ask those questions. You also, interestingly, talk about capacity to consent there. Because what you were saying was, in relation to the people that you were talking to, presumably had capacity to consent, and at the end of the day they were adults. Have you had experience of dealing with individuals that may be on the cusp of capacity to consent, or you're maybe not certain that they might have capacity, or indeed have you ever dealt with children in terms of your research?
For the research we're doing at the moment, which is looking at the lived experience of individuals who have been at the sharp end of inequality in the UK in the context of COVID, we made a deliberate decision not to interview under 16s and not to interview people who may lack capacity, such as people with learning disabilities or older people who may be suffering from different forms of dementia, because we felt as though we didn't have the skills to be able to determine whether those people did have capacity. And I know that capacity isn't something static, it's something which you have to look at on an ongoing basis, and that capacity is something which you might have capacity to do one thing, but you might not have the capacity to do something with huge, implications, such as make big financial decisions. And so I don't feel qualified to do that. And I would love to know how you would go about including people in your research where you're not sure what capacity they have, or how to make a determination as to whether they do have capacity to participate in the research.
Okay, so again, raising really important considerations about sampling, actually, in terms of the research project or indeed the intervention. And so again, this raises ethical issues in relation to who we include and who we exclude in our sample. So on the one hand, we would want to be as inclusive as possible when we do research, to include all of those who may well benefit from the research or indeed an intervention. For example, if there's an intervention that is going to be beneficial, that we presume may be beneficial in an experimental design study or a quasi-experimental design study, then we may feel that it would be unethical not to include people that that may benefit just by virtue of the fact that they don't have capacity to consent. And in the UK, we have something called the Mental Capacity Act of 2005, which provides information and guidance on how to, in a sense, test out capacity. Now, in the UK, and it may be different, of course, in different laws across the world, in different countries, but in the UK, under the Mental Capacity Act, there is a presumption that people have capacity unless we can prove otherwise that they don't have capacity. And in order to do that, there are various steps that you can take. And so this obviously protracts the length of time and the resources that you need to do the project. So those of you that are thinking about doing a project, then you will also need to think not only through these ethical issues, but also the logistics that go with them, the practical implications of your study. So you need to have a study that's manageable, and not only in terms of your time of whether you're interviewing humans, but also in terms of what you will have to put in place in order to meet those broadly ethical requirements to do the study. What do you think? Could this undermine the voluntary nature? We said that, one of the key ethical principles is voluntariness, that people have autonomy to volunteer to be in a particular project or not to be, to say no. They can say no at any point. So how do you balance that up with the voluntary nature, particularly in resource poor settings?
I think it's a really difficult one, and I think it comes out of a really positive transition in the way we look at the relationship between the researcher and the participant. So the organisation I'm working for at the moment, we would consider our participants to be experts by experience. So, I might be considered to be an expert by learning, but they are equally experts by experience. And as experts themselves, there is a strong argument to say that, well, if I'm being paid for doing the work, why shouldn't they be paid for doing the work? I think it could undermine, to some extent, the voluntary nature of the research. Even in the UK, which is not a resource poor setting, there is such poverty at the moment where people are going to food banks, which are free places where people can get free bags of food because they've run out of money at the end of the month. And so a small payment of, say, £30, which is what we're paying our participants for participating in our focus groups, could sway somebody to participate in research that they don't really want to participate in. And the way I am addressing that at the moment is to have a conversation with each and every participant before they decide whether they want to be involved in the research. And then I can get a sense of their motivations and their interests, and whether this is something that they feel passionate about. But to be honest, I still think it's a big challenge, and I'm not sure there's an easy answer to that question.
One of the something that people do is to not say that there is a payment, but to actually give it as a gift at the end, and that at the end as a thank you. So that means that there's been no kind of inducement to it's completely and utterly voluntary, and then but also you are actually paying that person a gift for their time. And in fact, of course, for people that are on benefits or like cash transfers or whatever the state in their particular country provides, it may well impact on that if they get a payment. And so, in fact, a cash gift or even a voucher is sometimes an option, I think, in relation to that. But again, these things need to be thought through. And as you say, in terms of when you're asking for the funding on your application form, you would need to, if you're considering paying participants or giving them a gift, you would need to actually factor that in and cost that into your overall costings. Okay, so that's something that you need to think through as well.
But I've been thinking a lot about informed consent. And when you study ethics, you get the impression that informed consent is solely about providing information about the research, what is going to be involved, whether the research will be anonymous, and all these other questions, and asking somebody to sign a form, and that's the end of the process. But I've been thinking increasingly that informed consent is something which is a process that goes through the research from start to finish, certainly until the publication is out there in the world, and then there's very little, I suppose, you can do about it then. But what I have made clear to the individuals who have agreed to participate in the research on lived experience of inequality is that they are welcome to turn up at it's all going to be online, of course, for the time being. They are welcome to turn up at the Zoom meeting, and then at any point in the Zoom meeting, they can say, I'm actually, something's come up. I can't be here. They will still be paid, but they're allowed to, I'm making it clear that they're able to leave at any point. And I suppose in a way that enables them to feel as though they aren't pressurized into participating in order to get the small fee, because they'll get the fee anyway.
That's a really good idea, Sara, and I've not heard of that before, so I think that might be really useful to people who are watching this. I think that's a very good idea, and of course that, again, like you say, there's all a host of ethical issues in terms of signed consent, and so some people may not be able to sign, they may not be able to read, they may not be able to write, they may not be able to even put an X for their signature. So what are some of the ethical issues that you found, Sara, in researching online of late?
Well, I think the main concern that I've had is that when you're doing an interview over Zoom, for example, you don't know who else is in listening distance. And if an individual wants to bring up something such as, we're not specifically reaching out to people who've experienced, say, domestic violence, because we don't feel that we're qualified to do research with that particular group. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that somebody isn't going to bring that up in an interview. And we don't know who's sitting in the room next door who might overhear what they say, and then something happens after the interview, and a safeguarding issue arises, and we have to deal with that. And so one of the things that I do when I speak to potential participants on the phone before organising the focus group is ask them where they're going to be, if they're going to be in a safe space, if there's going to be anyone else around, would they be concerned about that person hearing what they were saying? And if they are, is there somewhere else they can go? Could they go take their phone into their car? Could they sort of go on a walk and sit in a park? Is there somewhere private they can be? And I found that course about how to ensure confidentiality when working with people online really useful, because I hadn't thought about the implications of somebody sitting sitting in the next room and listening in to everything that was being said.
Yes, and I think these issues of privacy, in other words, in a private space, and keeping things that people say that may well be private and that they haven't talked about before is really, really key, as well as confidentiality, that what they tell us, they know that we're not going to tell anyone else. So I think what you're hitting on there again, Sara, is preparation. And so being mindful of these ethical issues, we have to prepare, we have to think before we've even kind of got into the field, we have to think about what ifs and all of that. And increasingly now with online, we have to think about this issue of privacy in particular. Presumably a lot of the people that will be applying for funding, their outcomes, there's a section of the application form that talks about objective outcomes, and some of those will be journal articles, for example. Now, you know as well as I do, Sara, that the people that we probably should read those journal articles don't, because they don't even get the articles. And very often in academia, it's other colleagues that are reading those articles. So how do we, in terms of the distribution of benefits and this gets into the ethical principle of justice in relation to, is this research justifiable in terms of the money that it's being spent, in terms of the process, and in terms of the outcomes?
Well, I feel very strongly, and I know that it's something which significantly adds to the workload of an academic, but I feel very strongly that there should be a range of outputs from a particular piece of research. So, of course, as an academic, you will have to produce journal articles and books, but they're not only inaccessible in terms of being expensive and behind paywalls, they're also often very inaccessible in terms of the language used. And I've seen some really good practice where summary reports and short case studies have been produced based on the research, and that has been shared with the participants. And the participants have been invited to come to various events to talk about those issues as equal partners in the process. And I think this touches on this issue of co-production that we're talking about more and more in the UK, to try and it's a term that has different meanings to different people, and I think it's quite hard to pin down. But for me, the heart of co-production is to try to break down the power dynamic between the researcher and the participants and to put them on an equal footing. And I think unless you make the materials that you're producing accessible, and unless you make the materials, or some of them at least, accessible, and unless you make the materials and the discussion around the materials open and accessible to the people who have participated in the research, I think you're potentially putting this artificial divide between researchers and participants, when the participants themselves are as much experts as the researchers, that they're just experts in a different way, and from a different type of learning.
Yes, and like you say, there's various ways of doing that through feedback workshops and events, and especially in some of the work that I've done in the past, where we've actually got some of the participants who wanted to would talk at those events themselves about the research, but also about their experiences of going through the research, what it meant to them, and giving us an evaluation, really, so that we can learn, because of course we're always learning as researchers, and ethics, it's not static for us. And every single project I've done over the last 30 years, there's always been an ethical issue that I hadn't maybe thought about. I can almost guarantee that. And there are some ethical issues that you forget from project to project. And so that's what's good about going through ethical review, actually, because it forces you to think through. So we shouldn't think of whether we have to go through ethical review, and if we do, we shouldn't think of that as just one more terrible thing I've got to get through. I've just got to get through ethics and then I can get out into the field, as a tick box kind of exercise. We need to think about it, specifically working in the areas and scenarios of the MENA region, as a really valuable tool that we can use so that we're very well prepared before we go out into the field. Thinking about knowledge exchange and other activities that people might be doing. So there's two separate application forms for this funding call: pure research, where people are gathering data and analysing it to disseminate it, and then activities which might involve interventions, and some of that might cross over. So for example, you could have an intervention which is a kind of a quasi-experiment, where you have one group of people that are getting the intervention and you're looking at what happens before and after. So you're hoping that your intervention is going to be very positive. And then in order to find out whether or not it's been beneficial, you might have a control group who don't get the intervention. But ethically, in terms of, beneficence, you would then want that control group to also have the intervention. And so you would put yourselves into a situation of having a wait list design where both groups do actually get an opportunity to experience that intervention. But there's other activities too, that knowledge exchange activities that you might engage in. For example, one example might be art, and that people are talking about their experiences and producing art, which you then have as a performance or gallery, that kind of thing, where you're not actually collecting data, but you're putting on this activity which provides knowledge. Now, the same ethical principles, we would argue, apply to those knowledge exchange activities, or those practical activities that are not necessarily going to result in a journal article. Okay, now we're sort of coming to the end now, Sara, but you talked about some of the difficult and maybe not so successful ethical experiences in the past. Do you have any real successes that you want to tell us about?
Well, I think all of the learning from the experiences that I've had in the past, where I've reflected back and wished I'd done things differently, I am now trying my best to put into the process of the research I'm doing now. And I really feel as though some of the things that we're doing with this lived experience of research on lived experience of inequality is working really well in terms of breaking down the barriers between the researcher and the person who's been being researched, the participant. The research is still in process, but thinking to talk to people in advance about what their needs are, especially in terms of their access needs. We've set up a research advisory group composed not only of academics, but also of people with lived experience who come together as equals to both critique our ethical procedures, but also the way in which we're doing the research. We've set up, I suppose you could call it like an accountability line, where if any of the participants have any concerns about the research and they don't feel comfortable coming to me, which is very difficult when you've built a relationship with someone, they can contact someone else within our institution and provide that information anonymously if they wish, which can then be fed back to me. So it's giving them the power to be able to, speak out about the research. So, I think they're some of the main things that doing research for 10 years has sort of led me to a position where I have been able to think in depth about breaking down those barriers in terms of the power relations, and also, I think really importantly, recognizing where my limitations lie. I would never, ever go to somewhere like the Gaza Strip after a military attack and start interviewing people when I didn't have an assessment of whether they were so psychologically traumatized that participating in an interview might re-traumatize them. And so I think that is also really important in terms of really understanding what you're trained to do and what you're not trained to do.
Ethical integrity as researchers, that we are rigorous in terms of what we produce. We are rigorous about the data. We're rigorous about the analysis, that we are transparent, that we analyze it academically and truthfully, and that we present a picture and we of the situation using the data as it is, and not necessarily what we want to politically push ourselves. And that goes not only in terms of quantitative data, but also qualitative, and what kinds of quotes we use when we're doing, for example, thematic analysis. Is it actually authentic? Is what we're saying, is it authenticated by enough quotes, for example, not just one outlier quote that's really juicy and that we want to put in because we think it sounds great. So I think that ends very perfectly in terms of taking us all the way through the research process, Sara. And so thank you so much for being in conversation with me for this project, and we wish you well with the work that you're currently doing. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rachel. It's great to speak to you.